So, kind of a follow up to our last episode on how to find a group. Once you have a group, how would you pick your game?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would look at figuring out who's in your group. So
Mm-hmm.
what do they want to do? I have a group that is very much kind of more of the hack and slash type of format. They would rather do that than, from what I can gather, there's at least one or two people there that would rather do that than
Mm-hmm.
in-depth role-playing type of thing. So we typically with that group stick with board games, D&D, 3.5. Now I'm going to try 5 again.
Yep.
Those sorts of games. And then I have another group that is more, I guess we're more experimental would be what I would say. Like we just want to try things.
Yeah.
So we've tried a bunch of other types of games, and that's where a lot of the conversations that you and I have about, like,
Mm-hmm.
space operas or political intrigue or whatever.
Yeah.
And so what I would do is I'd figure out what type of players you have. So if you have a new player that just wants to figure out how to roll as many dice as possible, then
D&D is probably better.
D&D is probably better. Also, I would look at it from a cost perspective. So, I mean, D&D is not cheap to get into. Like,
No.
yes, you can do it on the cheap, right? You don't have to have minis. You don't have to have the 3D printer other way, that's sitting right behind Jacob's head right there.
Yep.
You don't have to have any of those kind of cool things that to do that. You could buy cheap minis. You could even use like pencils
There's
and like little.
there's a whole entire like printout things
No,
of having
there you go.
like paper chits that you could use as
Yeah.
minis.
You could even use pennies and quarters if you really
Mm-hmm.
had to. But the point is that game's very highly intense in knowing like a 5 foot square is really a big deal.
Yes.
And so it's really important. Like D&D, I call it kind of like math. It's like for math
Math
people.
nerds.
Yeah, it really is because you want to know, angles and what's a 20 foot radius spread
Mm-hmm.
versus just a 20 foot radius burst versus a cone, right?
Mm-hmm.
All this stuff coming out of like, what's the cone coming out of? What's coming out of my hand? Oh, where's your hand located? It's like, oh my god, so many questions, right? Because it matters because you may miss me depending on
Mm-hmm.
where your hand is, versus like more of a free flowing game, which is almost everything else I've ever played. So like a GURPS,
Yes.
a Vampire Masquerade, a Shadowrun, a Mage of the Ascension. I mean, there's so many others, but anyway,
Mm-hmm.
all these other games are very like abstract, and so those games require very little cost to get in.
Yes.
And many of those games actually will have a quick cheat sheet that you can download for free to give you like how to build a character. And so
Mm-hmm.
your players wouldn't even necessarily need to buy a player's handbook. Where in D&D, if you're not playing, if you're playing a Magic user, you need your own player's handbook.
Mm-hmm.
So you're already in for 35, $40 just as a player. The
Yes.
DM's in, I'm going to say easily $200 investment for D&D.
If not more.
Just $200 to your annual salary. I mean, like literally, you can,
Mm-hmm.
and I really appreciate those channels that are like, here's how I make stuff out of foam, and it's really intriguing to me. But I know I'd get a divorce if I started like creating the entire Tomb of Horrors and like the Illithid stuff, because my wife would be like, "There's nowhere we're keeping this, just nowhere."
It's also the question of why.
Well,
You're gonna only pull it out once or maybe twice a
a
year.
lot of people try to figure out how to do the reusable stuff on that, but I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
I think what they're doing is amazing. Some really cool stuff. But the point of that whole thing is, it's just a lot of money. And so if
Yes.
you're tight on money, I would look to one of these other things, one of these things where you can get in for maybe a $20 PDF from Drive-Thru RPG, and that's all that you need, just that one PDF.
One PDF that you could give to everybody.
Done. Yeah, and then you can start playing around with it.
Mm-hmm.
That said, then you got to choose your genre, and I think that's the biggest piece, right? What do your players really want to play? So if they're not into rolling a ton of dice and they want to have like figures and minis on the table, now it's like the world's your oyster, and there are
Mm-hmm.
thousands of RPG games, thousands of RPG games I've never heard of, can't ever begin to start to play.
Definitely.
I have some on my shelf. Like I have this Sherlock game I kickstarted years ago. It's an RPG. We've never even pulled it out. We should pull it out, but we've never pulled it
Yep.
out. And it looks kind of fun, but I've just never pulled it out. And so there's so many games that I would love to play, but I just don't have the time for. And so at that point, what I would start doing is Google is your friend now. Start Googling like, hey, what's the best? So like, I like to do the mystery stuff. And at that point, I think If you're into mysteries, I think any of the systems by Pelgrane Press that use their mystery, I can't think of what it's actually called right now. It's Gumshoe is actually what the system is called. Gumshoe. So it's even in the name, right? Gumshoe is a detective. So their stuff is the Gumshoe system, and all of their works is based on Gumshoe. So if you want to do a D&D type of game, I think you pick up 13th Age. They have all sorts of little modules for all of that. All of them are found on DriveThruRPG. We'll put a link to DriveThruRPG in the Gumshoe system just so you can't miss it. But the whole point of that is find out what you want to do. Like if you want to do vampires in modern day, Vampire the Masquerade is probably your friend. If your players are okay being evil characters, because let's just be honest, there are no good characters, like good aligned characters in Vampire.
No.
Well, there are. They get eaten by you every morning or every night when you wake up. You got to go consume people, and these are the good characters that you're consuming, basically.
Yep.
So you want to do magic. I think mage is a great way to go forward if you want to do like magic in the modern era. I mean, there's a lot of games you can start playing, but what I would suggest doing is figure out what do your players really want to do, and then try to match a system for it.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty easy to learn, and I think that's the hardest part. I think that's maybe why I like the Pelgrane Press stuff so good, is because it's got a lot of simple. So the Gumshoe system is predicated on this, and I've talked about this before. I'll talk about it really brief. So Kenneth Haidt from Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff's podcast, from Ken used to work for Dungeons and Dragons before it was bought by Wizards, before it was bought by Hasbro. I like in the 2.0 days, like the AD&D days. And he would do these modules and stuff. So he would cut his teeth with Gary Gygax, the founder, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons. And so one of the things he talks about is like he had a problem with if you need to have your players find something very specific and needed, and they roll horrible, then your entire game is out the window. Mm-hmm. And for a new DM, you may not be able to recover from that. Right? We have a lot of shows on here where we talk about DMs recovering from bad things, DMs pivoting from bad things. We've talked about that a lot. Well, what he decided to do is, well, instead of relying on the DM to be able to figure that out, why don't we just create a game mechanic that the DM doesn't have to figure it out?
Yeah.
And so the thing there is simply this. If you have there's only 3 dots. There's only 3 dots in each skill. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a dot in that skill and you need to do a basic quote-unquote roll on it, you will automatically know enough information so the DM doesn't have to do all this weird like sorcery to get you to figure stuff out.
Yes.
Where like if you rolled a 1 on your spot check and everyone rolled a 1 on our spot check, well, okay, I'll just do it this way. Our last GURPS game, we had to keep rolling intelligence because it was the only skill that the DM could come up with that we could possibly do.
To throw us the bone.
And so we spent, I'm going to say, an hour waiting for us to get the bone thrown at us because none of us could roll well because my intelligence in that game is a 10.
Our highest was a 14, and everybody kept rolling
horrible, right? And so, and even then, we would get a success. But again, like the DM could have just said, oh, a success is a success. Let's just move on, as opposed to, oh, well, you need 5 successes for this to happen.
Definitely.
So there's all these things that you can do to help. But what he said is, like, let's not even have that. So in our game then, it would have been like, do you have 1 dot in this skill? And there's only so many skills. So you make sure that everybody in the party has at least 1 dot in every skill.
Yes.
And then the next thing you know, the DM just like, okay, cool. Well, who has a dot in this skill? Oh, I have a dot. Perfect. Make me a roll. Well, you're automatically going to get some information. Mm-hmm. If you do well on the roll, you'll get more information. But just by having 1 dot, you immediately know the information you need to know. So the DM's not spending literally an hour trying to figure out what to do. Yep. And that's kind of why I like the Gumshoe system as a whole. It's pretty easy to run as a new DM. Mm-hmm. And the nice thing is they have enough products out there that you can choose sci-fi versus fantasy versus modern versus, vampires versus spy. Well, it'd be vampires and spy, but whatever. Whole point of them is I really like their stuff because they've tried to figure it out. From DMing over for 30 years between both of them, because Robin D. Laws is also on that podcast, they feed off each other, and when they started creating products, they started creating products that look like, what was the thing that tripped me up as a DM? What was the thing that tripped up my friend when he was trying to DM?
Yep.
How do we make sure that they don't get tripped up? And so it's kind of nice. So instead of having to rely on a bunch of esoteric knowledge, some systems are designed in some way to help you out. And I would say that those guys do a good job of that. So anyway, shameless plug for them. I'm not getting any money from their stuff. So check them out, see what you think about it. But overall, like once you have your group formed, really figure out what kind of game you want to play.
Yes.
And if that's the game you want to play, then go play it. So if it's D&D, go ahead, spend it. Just know you're going to spend some money to get into it. If it's something else, then know that you might be in for 20 or 30 bucks, maybe less, on a PDF, and you're done. It doesn't take that much to get into. And then you and your players can be up and rolling that same night. And hopefully, if you pick a good system, you're not fighting with the rules, which is kind of what I always feel like I'm doing in many systems that we play. So that's it. You have a good night.